The League for Social Reconstruction was formed. The League for Social Reconstruction was a group of left-wing academics in Canada, largely centered in Montreal. It included people like Eugene Forsey, if some of you know who he is. He was a colleague of Pierre Trudeau's that Mr. Trudeau later appointed to the Senate. It involved a very, very young David Lewis. People like Underhill were part of it, Scott, and Graham Spry. In 1932, the Ginger Group and the LSR hold meetings in William Irvine's office. Remember, William Irvine is the Labour MP from Calgary. Calgary, not Regina, not Weyburn, Saskatchewan, Calgary. The Ginger Group and LSR, all these left-wing academics, held meetings in Irvine's MP office to form the CCF party. That's where they did it. Woodsworth was the interim leader. The 1932 founding convention was in Calgary, which is that, and it was named the CCF. In 1932, and these people understood what it meant to shape public opinion. I hope I'm not bouncing around here too much. Forgive me if I am. If anybody wants to stop me, please do. What I'm trying to do is take 100 years and push it into 15, 20 minutes. The same year that the Ginger Group created the CCF in Alberta, with all these Labour MPs and a Labour left-wing government, this guy emerged in 32. And Eberhard, as well as Spry, understood the levers of power and what it meant to shape and influence the beliefs of people. And that if you could shape the beliefs, you could ultimately control the way they would do all kinds of other things. Eberhard took to the airwaves, formed Social Credit. He took to the airwaves in 32, he formed Social Credit in 35, he won a majority, and it was Eberhard who derailed the left in Alberta. He derailed the CCF, he derailed the United Farmers of Alberta, he wiped them out. And it isn't that he wiped them out because of political organization or strategy. I'm not suggesting they didn't have good people or strategists. The key to what Eberhard was doing was communication. Using radio, he shaped the perspective of the people who had to make decisions about these issues. 1 year later, after Eberhard went on the air, and after the CCF is founded in Calgary, the next convention of all these guys was in Regina. And in Regina, they passed what they referred to at the time as the Regina Manifesto, simply because it was passed in Regina. It isn't that it was created there. The convention, there was Spry and other LSR academics are the authors of the Regina Manifesto. And interestingly, the end of the Regina Manifesto actually indicates that the men and women who are part of this movement and backing it, and this is literally what it says, will not rest until capitalism is eradicated. I'm not making this up. If any of you want to go online, just Google Regina Manifesto, go to the last couple of paragraphs at the end of the document, that's where it is. That they will not rest till capitalism is eradicated. Okay, this is 1933. 2 years later, Douglas was elected a CCF MP. That's 2 years after the manifesto. And then from 1920 to 41, so here we're looking at about a 20-year span. Now keep in mind all that's going on here, and how it's labor and the progressives and the left-wing agricultural organizations that are dominating everything that's going on and largely control the media. Collectivist ag organizations are booming and very influential, representing the heart of Western political muscle. Newspapers, newsletters, meetings, local committees, and most with political affiliations. The Canadian Wheat Board monopoly in 1941 ended the free market. And after that time, collectivist organizations later claimed, falsely, that the Canadian Wheat Board was created to protect farmers from the free market. Actually, the real mandate was based on holding down wheat prices during World War II in order to save the federal treasury money. What was happening at the time is that every time the price of wheat, the free market price of wheat went up 1 cent, it was costing the federal government $2.5 million. That's why the Canadian Wheat Board was created. If any of you want to go into that later, it's a fascinating story. If you want all the background on it, pick up a book written by Mitchell Sharp called This I Remember. Mitchell Sharp was a cabinet minister in the Trudeau government. Mitchell Sharp was in the room when they created the Canadian Wheat Board monopoly. And the story of what actually happened and how it emerged is in that book. It's quite a fascinating story. This is how the CCF presented itself to the public. Mom, dad, kids, here's the rainbow. Prosperity, justice, democracy, unity. Don't know what that says. Yeah, equality, freedom, security. Your security obviously comes from the government. And what the government will do for you. Okay, these dotted lines we've already gone over. In 1956, so that's, I don't want to go there yet. In 1944, the CCF wins 47 to 53 seats. From 42 to 45, Spry, remember who he was? He served as a personal assistant to Sir Stafford Cripps, who was the Labour Minister in the British cabinet. And after World War II, Spry was named Agent General of Tommy Douglas's CCF government in London. In fact, Spry stayed as Douglas's representative in government for a long, long, long time. In the 60s, Spry played a crucial role during the 1962 Saskatchewan doctors' strike against socialized Medicare. The doctors didn't want socialized Medicare. They all went on strike. And Spry, who was in London representing Douglas, started recruiting British socialist doctors who supported government Medicare to ship them to Saskatchewan so that they could push the policy through. That's how it happened. This is actually not even secret. It's quite public now. A lot of people didn't know it initially, but it's quite public now. Throughout this period of time, this 80-year window, LSR members utilize all kinds of means and magazines to educate and shape opinion. They understood what they were doing. The CBC was established by this time. And Forsey Underhill, who was a co-author of the manifesto, Watkins, who was co-founder of the Waffle, and Spry were the ones whose fingerprints were on the Regina Manifesto. And for the sake of time, I'll skip that. I didn't mention, I guess I must have missed it somewhere, but if you go back here to this section here, a radical movement emerged in Canada that shaped public opinion, what was going on in editorials, certainly the attitudes of elected officials. Something called One Big Union emerged. One Big Union meant the whole country would be a union. It was right after the Russian Revolution. And these were individuals who wanted one big union. The Soviet Union, everything was a union. This was the aggressive side of the left. A number of their leaders ended up being arrested. Some of this led to the Winnipeg strike. We don't have time to go into a lot of this, but there were guys who went to jail. One of their key leaders, a guy named Russell, was sentenced to 2 years, as I recall. One Big Union actually was formed in Calgary in 1919, not Regina, Calgary. And that numbered as many as 70,000 members. In 1956, it actually merged with the Canadian Labour Congress. This One Big Union actually formally, publicly passed endorsements of the Russian Bolsheviks and of the German Spartacus movement. This is in Canada. The German Spartacus movement was the equivalent of the, roughly, I mean there's always nuances and subtleties because you're dealing with different cultures, but roughly the equivalent of what the Bolshevik movement was in Russia. They were committed socialists with a very clear, well-defined agenda. So in '56, One Big Union merged with the Canadian Labour Congress. 5 years later, the NDP is created. When the CCF merged with the Canadian Labour Congress, declared mandate is higher corporate tax, government monopoly on healthcare, accelerated spending on social programs. You can go through it, and we already talked about Spry. I hope I'm succeeding in conveying what was going on in the press and in the media, what people were talking about. A couple of the most significant organizations during this whole era were the Prairie Wheat Pools. The influence of the Prairie Pools was absolutely stunning, and I'll show you more. First we'll look at 2 more slides. Here's what happened next. Now we've got about 70 years of paradigm shaping, where there's individuals who know what they're doing. In 1969, the Palliser Wheat Growers Association emerged as one of the very first organizations to contend against the policies of the left. Good organization, founded by a guy named Wally Nelson. Wally's still living, he lives in Avonlea, Saskatchewan. The mandate of the Wheat Growers Association, though, what became the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association, this was its original name, they saw their mandate as changing policy instead of shaping the paradigm. In 1969, the National Citizens Coalition is formed in reaction to the Liberal budget. It was founded by Colin Brown. In 1969, John Bullock founded the CFIB, largely in reaction to the budget of Alan McEachran. These organizations on the right were emerging in response to the consequence of the paradigms that had been laid down and set by these people over a long, long period of time. The difference being is that instead of fully identifying what the source of these policies were, they just fought the policies instead of the cause of the policies. In 1973, Alberta Report magazine emerged, which clearly had a political mandate and consideration. The C.D. Howe Institute was formed. The Fraser Institute is founded. If you want to study something really fascinating, study one of the key guys who founded the Fraser Institute. Maybe we can talk about this in a minute. And also in the 1970s, all kinds of policy grower organizations emerged. Barley, oats, flax, all these guys. Inevitably, though, these groups viewed their mandate as policy. They wanted to change the policies. They thought if we can get the right guy elected, we can change the policies. Notice across the years the clear distinction between the people and organizations that focused on changing policies at the legislative level, they wanted to bend the arm of the politician, versus the people and organizations that focused on changing the opinions and beliefs and paradigms of the people and deliberately set up the mechanisms that could do it. In 1987, the Western Assembly and Reform Association emerged. The mandate, the West wants in. Policy, primarily. But there were some really good things that grew out of this. In 1989, we founded the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. The publications that we began to put out at that time, there was an editorial writer in Vancouver, her name was Barbara Yaffe. And she saw some of the first publications that we had done. I was actually the editor of this, one of the highest compliments anybody ever paid me on some of the stuff we were writing and doing. She got a hold of one somehow, I don't know how. She wrote an editorial calling our literature, she said it's like a Playboy for the taxpayer. And she actually said in her editorial, she said it titillates and it opens your eyes. And she went on talking about these publications, but at that, this is in '89. Now by this time, Alberta Report's already been going almost 15 years. Shaping the perspective of what people think. At that time, between the CTF and Alberta Report, annual spending on conservative policy promotion between the two of us exceeded $5 million. We weren't trying to change politicians, we were shaping public opinion. We were spending a lot of money doing it. I estimate that we had 10 million annual contacts based on weekly exposures. And what I mean by that is that if you take Alberta Report, what we were doing there, and what we were doing at the Taxpayers with our media stuff, our publications, the number of newspapers that our weekly commentaries were being carried in, if you count how many times people were exposed to that message, now the same person might have been exposed 50 times throughout the course of the year, 200 times, but if you add it all up, if you look at our circulation and their circulation, readership per issue, and put it all together, you're up into double-digit millions as to what was happening. Okay, here. In December of 1992, Ralph Klein became Premier. Now look at what's been going on. Klein became Premier in '92. A month later, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we held the Calgary Taxpayers Convention. We drew huge numbers of people. Some of you here were probably there. You were there?
Yep.
These were advocates not just from Canada, but from all over the world, and especially Alberta. It was a major media event. We had the representatives of California's Proposition 13 was there. New Zealand's Labour Finance Minister, Roger Douglas, was there, who was responsible for dramatically reforming New Zealand's government and spending patterns. Lou Euler, who was a junior member of Reagan's cabinet In California, the founder of the U.S. National Tax Limitation Committee was there. Preston was there. Linda Haverstock from Saskatchewan was there, played a key role in some things. There were leading national and international spokespeople. Dave Yeager was one of the panelists who was there, talking about the role of government in our lives. This is 2 months after Ralph Klein became elected, following on the heels of these kinds of exposures. Are you beginning to get the picture of what the paradigm looks like and what shaped it? 1993, this is the year after Klein became premier. By accessing public opinion, by shaping the paradigm, the Reform Party policies. And the Reform Party was more of a grassroots thing in many ways than it was a singular policy initiative. And those who were astute, I think, recognized that what we were doing at the Taxpayers was feeding it. Like, we were never partisan in a deliberate sense. We never colluded with anybody or planned anything. It's just that the agendas matched and one fed off the other. If you take that Alberta report and the CTF, all these things together, there was enormous pressure put on Ralph Klein and his government to slash spending, public fights. Jason was running our Alberta, Jason Kenney was running our Alberta operation at the time. I was Jason's boss. And some of you may remember the public fight that Jason got into. Klein was fighting us. He didn't cave. We fought him to a standstill, and eventually Klein accused us publicly of going in and raiding old folks' homes. And there were people from the press that were calling old folks' homes to see if taxpayer people had been there to fleece old ladies. And when the answer came out that nobody ever heard of nothing like this, Klein had to begin to back up. We were putting so much pressure on him, not because our focus or the focus of the Reform Party or the focus of Alberta Report was Ralph Klein. We had shaped the paradigm, and it was the paradigm that was putting pressure on Ralph Klein. Here's what's happened since then. 1917 till today, there's been massive growth of public sector union influence. PSAC has 180,000 members, the UP has 80,000. We now see in Alberta the Parkland Institute, the Public Interest Alberta. The directors of these organizations read like a who's who of the left. Most taxpayers in Canada and Alberta don't yet realize the coming impact of public sector pensions. Most people don't realize what's coming. The idea that Greece can face all this stuff and have to cut the mustard and that it's not going to confront us is a fantasy. It's coming. Another book, if any of you get to read, Pension Ponzi. It's the story of unfunded pension liabilities in Canada and what's coming. The subheading is something to the effect of how public sector unions are bankrupting the country and are going to destroy your retirement. In 1990s, early 90s, the Prairie Center Policy Institute emerged, the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies, the Frontier Center for Public Policy. We created the Prairie Center Policy Institute. After I left the Taxpayers, we created the Prairie Center Policy Institute largely because I had come to understand, and a few others that we were working with, we had come to understand that the practical political expression of the left throughout all that century was the Canadian Wheat Board monopoly. That was it. And we launched the Prairie Center. We never ever met with politicians to discuss the Wheat Board. We never did. We didn't do it. The only thing we ever did, we wrote a bunch of literature. We put out about 500,000 pieces of literature. The Canadian Wheat Board was one of the few agencies exempt from the Access to Information Act, meaning nobody really knew what was going on inside there, or had gone on for decades. And we put together a publication, and I researched and wrote a booklet called An Act of War, which was the history of the Canadian Wheat Board monopoly. We distributed about 150,000 of them, as I recall. And then we took Jim and me and Rick. Who else was with us? Ike Lanier and Buck Spencer was with us. He smashed up his car. I forget who all was with us, but we all flew down to Ontario. And we arranged to meet with newspaper editors from the Globe and Mail and from the Kingston Week Standard. And we were meeting with newspaper editors, explaining to them what was going on in Western Canada and how this agency was exempt from any access to information provisions or accountability. And then these guys ended up in Ottawa. But the point is that we were working to shape the paradigm. The Frontier Center for Public Policy emerged in Winnipeg. That's Peter Hawley. Peter was the very first member of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He ran our Manitoba operation at the CTF. I'll skip some of these for the sake of time. Landowner Talk Radio, for 2 years leading up to the last election, Keith Wilson and I were on the air in some of the ridings where some of you guys got elected. What Keith and I were doing, we were attempting to shape the paradigm on property rights. That was it. And that's what we did. And in fact, some of the, I don't know if any of you guys want to comment on this, but a number, as it got into the last days of the campaign and there were some real tough spots and tough things being faced, we found it interesting that the place where support for Wild Rose held was largely in areas where our programs could be heard, because we had been talking to people for 2 years, week after week after week after week, what the issues were and why they mattered. So when push came to shove, there were a number of people that were so well informed that they weren't about to be spooked. Let me leave you with one more story about this and then we'll get out of this thing. At the Taxpayers, after we had put out all kinds of literature on federal spending, I was listening. We had been doing this for months. We wouldn't meet with elected officials at that time. In fact, I even remember once being phoned by cabinet ministers in the Premier's office wanting to meet with us, and we said no. We said, well, we've nothing to say to you. I mean, we're not set up to talk to you. We're not lobbying you. If you want to talk to somebody, go talk to your constituent. And we just kept putting out literature. I was listening to a radio talk program one day, and a farmer phoned in and began beating up on, Larry Schneider was actually on the radio. Larry Schneider was an MP from Regina, maybe some of you know him, but they were implementing policies that weren't good. And this guy took him to the cleaners on the radio. You would have sworn that I was talking to the guy, or that Jason was talking to the guy, Jason Kenny. And the reason is that we had provided this man with a clear understanding of what was going on. He understood it, he grasped it, the paradigm in his head had been shifted, and he took on the elected official. Quite wisely, in my judgment. The elected official might not agree, but that's what happened. In 2007, the Wild Rose Party emerged on the tail end of all this. And I'll leave it with this. I would encourage you just again to think through the difference between all these organizations on the left who are shaping the paradigm. Graham Spry's never been elected to anything. Nothing. In fact, Pierre Trudeau tried to put him in the Senate in, I think 1970 it was, or 71. And Spry turned it down. He wasn't interested. I mentioned that agriculture was the key to the thing. This is a map pointing out the circulation of the Western producer, which was put together by Harris and Waldron, remember. Two guys who set out to deliberately shape the attitude of people at the grassroots. The number here is about 94,000, I think. 60. Anyways, that's it. I won't spend a lot of time on that. I just wanted you to see what that was. The old political paradigm leads people to believe they can gain a majority government solely on the basis of policy. And that upon gaining it, they'll be able to easily adjust or amend policies and practices in whatever manner they choose. This paradigm mistakenly assumes that Ralph Klein created and led the parade, the spending cut parade, and overlooks the dilemma experienced by other elected individuals such as Charlie Mayer and Grant Devine. My thesis is that Ralph Klein did not create the parade that he became known for having created. Instead, Mr. Klein wisely sensed that a parade was afoot and decided to get in front of it with his baton. He was eventually given credit for having created it, despite the fact that he did not. That's not a criticism of Mr. Klein. He's an astute politician. But he saw the parade coming by. Consider the paradigm-shaping effect that had occurred all the time leading up to his election. There were several deliberately applied power sources that knowingly established the environment that compelled Ralph Klein to cut spending and that enabled Ralph Klein to cut spending. And as skillful as Mr. Klein's backroom political strategists are said to have been, and may well be, the truth is that in a strong wind, even turkeys can fly. and look like they're doing it with ease. Have you ever thought about what would have happened to Ralph Klein if he wouldn't have cut spending? Wrap your mind around that one. He'd have been gone. He couldn't have held office. His own party would have thrown him out. I'm not suggesting, and we're not suggesting, that political parties are entirely reliant upon factors that are outside their sphere of influence. They're not. Instead, it is to point to the necessity of understanding that the political process is not a war of ideas. There's an element of that there, but that's not what the political process is. It's a competition in communication strategy and resource development. That's the fight you're in. It's not a policy fight. This is it. And that the strategy you embrace as individuals and as a party must be deliberate, far-reaching, and take in a wider loop than many people might previously have realized. A war is bigger than a battlefield. You may have a battlefield, even more than one, and it may be a policy battlefield, but that ain't the war. Most of what wins wars is not even who's right and wrong. It's the development of resources and the way you deliver the resources. That's what wins contemporary wars. It's what's always won wars. How do you package yourself? We've got about 10 minutes left here. Let's look at how do you package yourself as a political party or as a constituency association? How do you present yourself to people? This is how others have packaged themselves. Now, these are companies here. But Toyota, I don't think this is true anymore, but at one time, its mission statement, its purpose for being, was to build cars that people everywhere will love to drive. How'd you like to work in a place like that? You just go in and say, what are you guys doing here? Oh, we're working to build cars that people everywhere would love to drive. Even the people who build Fords are not going to compete or argue against that objective. To fulfill your dreams through the experience of motorcycle. It's Harley Davidson's mission. To save people money so they can live better. Walmart. You know what these guys really want to do? They want to make a profit. But they all understand the difference between the way they present and package themselves and the policies that enable them to do that. There's a difference between how you present yourself and pursue your objective and the policies you maintain to get there. For people outside your party or association, packaging your objective creates a fixed way for them to look at you and what you are seeking to achieve. If I have to stop here for a minute, I will. Let me take 60 seconds to just rest. Really, there's only 10 minutes left. I don't want to lose anybody, and I'm fearful that I am. Am I right, or should I go on? Or should I go on? For people outside your party or association, now think of who this is. The way you package what you want to achieve creates a fixed way for them to look at you, think about you, and understand what you're seeking to achieve. If as a constituency, association, and political party, if you can't or won't concisely explain to people who you are and what you are setting out to do, someone else will do it. And don't confuse your policies with what you want to achieve. How you farm and why you farm are not the same thing. They're different. What your policies are and why you want your policies are two different things. Like, why do you want the policies that you guys have in your policy manual? Why do you want them? What is it you want? What do you want Alberta to look like? And what would Alberta look like if we had those policies? Describe it in one sentence. What is it?
Conservative.
I'm sorry?
Conservative.
Is that it?
We want to fulfill our dreams through the experience of smaller government.
If you go there, you're immediately moving back to policy. Because the minute you go to values or conservative, like some of you may disagree with me, if you do, that's fine. But the minute that we make policy or values or ideas inherent to our objective, you're forcing people to make a decision about you. In the case of Toyota, they say their purpose is to build cars that people everywhere would love to drive. Nobody's going to disagree with you on that, not even your opponents.
In my opinion, people seem to be stuck in their perception of making change. They think if they have the right leader, the right candidates, and the right policy, that's all they need to win. Well, it's not.
I see Art's here. Hi, Art, and welcome. Let me throw out an idea. I was at a meeting one time where in a situation where the Mulroney government had a majority, and we had a meeting with Charlie Mayer. Charlie was the minister of the wheat board or ag. I'm not quite sure what his whole portfolio encompassed at the time. There were about 30 representatives from ag organizations meeting with a minister who had spent his life advocating the implementation of a dual marketing system. He wasn't opposed to the wheat board, he was opposed to the monopoly of the wheat board. I was in a meeting where all these grower organizations were wanting to know from Charlie when he was going to end the wheat board. And Charlie did his best, I thought, to convey to them why he couldn't do that. Like, just because you have a majority, it doesn't mean that you can go ahead and implement all the policies you want. If you don't have the soil prepared for the seeds that you intend to sow, your crop ain't going to grow. And even if you guys, as a party, form a majority government, the idea that you're going to be able to implement the reformist policies you want easily, let me suggest to you, you're dreaming. The unions could shut you down. The idea that unions can't close down a province, and won't, don't think that won't happen here if you pick this fight. If you don't prepare the way ahead of where you're going and establish allies that you need in order to do the things you're doing, you won't be able to implement your policies. The reason we can get into it. Let's go here. I want to get this done. Packaging what you want to achieve will give you and your colleagues a paradigmatic framework within which to work, and that will enable you to focus on what you want to achieve rather than on your policies. There's a dramatic and important difference between your policies and what you want to achieve. Sell the sizzle. If you cannot say what you want to achieve, somebody else is going to do it. Here's the last bunch of slides. I feel like I'm trying to rush here. I hope I don't. Do I need to rush?
Yes.